What is going on with Blizzard and their raid balancing? I can't even fathom how they could have missed the mark in such a big way. So, the latest raid in World of Warcraft, Sepulture of the First Ones, had a huge round of nerfs. Some of the biggest nerfs that I have ever seen for a raid. Like, let's take Luhuvim for example. He received a 90% damage reduction to his Resonance Cascade ability. And then you have Halandris. He got a 75% and a 65% damage reduction to his abilities. And these are just but a few examples of a list that goes on and on with massive nerfs to health, cast timers, and damage. So when you see nerfs of this magnitude, you really have to wonder,
what the f*** were they thinking?
Who are they designing these encounters for if they have to get nerfed like this? These are the types of changes you might expect to see in a beta, when the developers are still testing the encounters, not a released and finished product. It's almost like Blizzard have no idea what they are doing, and they had no idea what kind of damage and HP would be reasonable. Best of all, everyone that was raiding this tier had the privilege to pay Blizzard to act as their QA team. Because as we all know, their internal QA team lacks the ability to clear their own raids. Which really calls to question, how do they even know if the fights are tuned reasonably? When you see these 60, 70, 90% nerfs to damage, it's obvious they don't. The real problem is that Blizzard have this obsession with making sure that a handful of guilds get this really big challenge, so they crank that stat dial all the way to 11. And I think this is a really poor decision. I don't know why they feel the need to do that. What does it matter if world first raiding guilds clear the encounters in a few days? Does it hurt the designer's sense of pride or something? Oh no, players who made raiding their job were able to beat our encounters really fast. How shocking and surprising. Who would have thunk people who play the game 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, clear the content really fast? But I think the effect of balancing these encounters for those few guilds and nerfing it later on is really bad for the overall health of raiding. How many players quit raiding because the encounters were tuned to such a ridiculous degree? When an ability gets a 90% reduction in damage, I mean, that really says it all, right? Here are some of the reasons why I think this kind of balanced nerf design is a big negative. So, one big negative with the crank it to 11 and nerf it later on is, what if you want to have the same experience that the world first raiding guilds had? Well, that is not an option for the vast majority of raiders. Most players do not have the ability to raid for 8 hours a day, so they won't be able to clear their tier before the nerfs start rolling in. Another negative with the way that Blizzard balances these raids, and this one has happened to me before, and on more than one occasion, is what happens when a guild that has been progressing on an encounter for weeks, and is so close to the clear that they can taste it, and then the encounter receives a huge nerf, and the guild demolishes it their next pull. Well, that guild was just robbed of all that time and progress, and it feels really bad. It's like Mythic Raiding has 3 levels of difficulty. You have the World First difficulty, where the fights are cranked up to 11. You have the First Nerf difficulty, you know, after the World First raiding guilds are done, and then the encounters start getting some adjustments. And then you have the Big Nerf difficulty. This indicates to me that Blizzard have no idea what they want Mythic Raiding to actually be. You know, do they want it to be this really hardcore experience that not everyone will clear? Do they want it to be a challenging experience that is also accessible? Trying to make Mythic both, does that make anyone happy? A little bit of a tangent here, but I promise, it's to make a point. A while back ago, in Final Fantasy XIV, the raid designers created a Savage raid tier, Savage being basically Mythic, that was so difficult that it almost killed the raiding scene. Sound familiar? So, what the developers decided was that Savage raids would not be that demanding. To satisfy those looking for such a challenge, a new difficulty was crafted, Ultimate Raids. And they were created purely for the challenge. There is no gear progression or gear rewards for this difficulty, just cosmetics. So that meant players who engaged with these very challenging encounters, they did so for the thrill of it, because they wanted to gain mastery over them. The point being, I think Blizzard could do the same thing. They could create a difficulty above Mythic that is there purely for those who want the most demanding, challenging encounters. And for this mode, there wouldn't be any kind of gear progression or gear rewards. Maybe just some cosmetics. It's sort of like very high level keys in Mythic Plus. The only players doing like plus 25s are those who really love to push more and more demanding dungeons. But for everyone else, the goal is capped at 15. That is where meaningful rewards end. You know, I also don't see any reason why Mythic shouldn't allow for flex raiding. I think that would open it up to so many more guilds, and make the raiding scene healthier overall. Blizzard have said that Mythic was set to 20, so that they could balance it better. But obviously that is not the case. Going by these recent nerfs, it looks like the only thing Blizzard knows how to balance is their checkbook. Anyways, so in summary, I just don't get why Blizzard prioritized the world-first raiding guild's experience over the general health of raiding. If a majority of players aren't participating in the raids, and they are waiting on these nerfs, how is that a good thing? And what does it say to guilds who have been progressing on an encounter for a while, only to have it nerfed, making all that progress feel empty and meaningless? I really don't see this as a good way to go about balancing the raids. Anyways, what do you all think? For me, these massive nerfs have made my interest in playing Dragonflight literally take a nosedive. I just don't trust Blizzard's ability to balance. I love raiding, but the developers of WoW have just been constantly making decisions that make it really hard for me to ever want to raid in that game again. Well, that's all for now. Thank you so much for listening to this ramble. I hope you are all having a fantastic day, and until next time, bye!